Yeah, and I appreciate everybody joining. I have to say, I'm just honestly incredibly honored and humbled to be asked to present here for Southwest Fire Science Consortium. There's a lot of really good science that's going on right now. Certainly, a lot of folks and talks that I'd like to listen to. So I appreciate you guys taking the time to jump in on this and being asked to do it. And then so Sarah is on the call as well too. I kind of worked it out with her before, and she can jump on if she wants. I think I'm going to be doing the bulk of the presentation, the PowerPoint. And then during questions and discussion, she'll jump on there as well too. And if anything comes up along the way, we're going to be talking about a couple different things. But like Liz said in the introduction, my main dissertation research is primarily focused on managed fire. Managed wildfire is something I've had a passion for a long, long time. It's really the only thing that was the subject I was interested enough into coming back into school after 15 years of working in the field. I really feel like from a fuels management standpoint, I think it's a vast untapped resource and a methodology for moving forward. And I feel like the social science part of it is the part that is what we really need to get our heads around more. So in the presentation, when I talk about managed wildfire, and I'm hoping to talk about this more later, but it just means a fire that's being managed for something other than full suppression, whether it be resource benefit or safety or whatever else. And there's two different things in the webinar I'm hoping to talk about. Just from an overview standpoint, first is this mixed methods review paper that that we published myself and Sarah and then Alistair Smith from the University of Idaho. Alistair's my major professor that I'm working for there. We published this mixed methods review paper, so that's going to be the first part of it that we discuss, and then it actually ties in pretty well into the second part of the webinar, which is dialoguing about some research that is sort of ongoing. Well, it is ongoing right now. I took the bulk of the data last spring, and they tie in well. So that's the two parts of this conversation. So the first one is called, again, we published it back in September in the journal Fire. It's called a Mixed Methods Literature Review and Framework for Decision Factors that May Influence the Utilization of Managed Wildfire on Federal Lands in the USA. And we put USA on there because it really is pretty specific to the United States Federal Wildland Fire Service. I forgot to start my timer. Let me do that. Okay. And if you want, we can put a link into it. The reason we did this, it served the mixed methods review. The reason we did this is that, first of all, it didn't exist already. And I cast about looking for how to approach the literature review that, of course, I need to do for my dissertation. And they're just, there's papers about managed fire out there, but a lot of them are really about a risk and, and that sort of thing, but not so much about on the qualitative side, the social science part. So the fact that it didn't exist already was a good reason to do it. But it did come with some pretty severe limitations, considering the fact that there wasn't a lot of research, which I'll talk about it in a little bit here as well, too. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that I did just recently find out that I had a proposal accepted to the IAWF conference in Pasadena in May. So hopefully some of you guys will be able to attend that. I'll be given probably a more lengthy conversation about the future research then, hopefully in person. It's just up the road from where I'm living here in San Diego. So, and I don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to move on through here. Just real quick on the methods. I know people don't want to spend a lot of time on methods, but it was a very comprehensive lit search. If you read the paper, there's a pretty long section from a method standpoint, but I looked at about 8,400 papers. This process alone took about 8 months to get through. I wanted to be very exhaustive. So had real comprehensive inclusion criteria, and I almost feel like I need to say yada, yada, yada. We came up with 23 papers that met our inclusion criteria. And just a note on the inclusion criteria for what we included in the mixed methods review was that it basically had to be papers that were primary source and someone that was a researcher specifically researching decision factors for managed fire, for whether to manage a fire or not, or someone that was in a position to make that decision themselves. So there was a lot of papers that you might feel like are absent if you look at the papers that were included, but most of them were actually referencing one of the primary source papers that we included, one of the 23. And the other thing is that the review only encompassed a time period from 1972 to 2013. But even the 2013 paper didn't, all of that included data from before 2009 when the policy changed. So it was actually all pre-2009 policy, and I didn't find any papers after the 2009 policy change, which is relevant because for future research, it's something that in our research we're doing now, we're actually going back and validating whether those decision factors are still present even post 2009. So I'll move to the analysis then. So we looked at 23 papers. What we did is did qualitative coding in vivo. In the analysis, we ended up finding this is kind of a convoluted coding strategy, but if at the end, if you look at it, I think there's a reason why it's so convoluted, is because this conversation and the overall context of whether to manage a fire or not and what the ramifications of that are in and of itself actually very complex. So I think that got kind of reflected with the way that our coding strategy ended up working out. And I'll explain this in a little bit more detail here. We ended up with 3 main topic codes, which are simply the barriers, facilitators, and the unaligned. And then we found a lot of descriptive themes, which were just individual little factors that somebody mentioned in a paper. We actually found 110 different ones of those. And what we did is, you go big, then you go real small, and then you consolidate that again. And we consolidate that into these 6 key theme areas. So for just as an example, when we're reading the paper, if there was someone that discussed something like, and this is real salient for the paper, we didn't have enough resources to manage the wildfire for resource benefit. What I would do is, from a coding strategy, code that for something like lack of resources and then put that as a barrier. Again, they said we didn't have enough resources to manage the fire. They would have liked to. So that would be coded as a lack of resources and seen as a barrier. Yeah. So what that strategy gave us was this figure, which is in the paper. And what this does is it shows the decision nexus at the top with the 6 key theme areas, and I'll show this framework. So you get a thematic category, and then that, again, you get one theme, and that could either be a facilitator, it could be a barrier, or it could be unaligned. And the unaligned was the weirdest one in a way, but I think it was actually kind of important. And we came up with all kinds of different names for this. I think we were lingering on decision point for a long time, but there was other semantic ramifications for that. So the unaligned is a little hard to get your head around, but it basically just means it's something that someone talked about. But when they talked about it in the context of the paper, they didn't necessarily say it as a facilitator. It definitely didn't necessarily come across as a barrier, but it was still present enough to be mentioned. And so it's really more of a conditional or contextually dependent factor. And actually, really, of all of them, I think the unaligned are the ones that probably need to get researched more in the future. And so what this looks like is the 3 topic codes, like I just talked about. Those are the facilitators, unaligned, or barriers. The key themes, one of them is this top one, so say fire environment, and I'll discuss the rest here too. I'm actually going to go through all the key themes because those were really the ones that sort of made the most sense overall. And then underneath all of the key themes are these descriptive codes. And most of these, some of them overlapped across key themes, but most of them were pretty contingent to it. So for instance, fire environment was really looking at things like on the facilitator side, things like favorable climate or favorable fire behavior, that sort of thing. And that's where all these 110 floated in there. And we have a whole table in the paper that shows what these are and then how many times we found them in the papers too, if you want to look at it. And then this is what we called at the end, kind of put it all together into what we call the managed fire decision framework, which I know this is a lot. It's hard to see. It's actually I struggled with this for a long time for how to visualize this, but I think this is the best way that we could come together, and I think it works. So in the middle, you have your decision nexus, which is ultimately an agency administrator or fire manager has to make a decision. And with that decision, you're pulling in information. And so the 6 key themes are institutional influences, operational considerations, fire outcomes, the fire environment, the perceived risk of the decision, and the socio-political context of the decision. And so you have all these factors running around. I kind of think about this as an agency administrator just trying to make that decision about whether they should manage it or not. And these are all the things that they could decide, could factor into the decision. We're not saying that all 110 are present in every decision, but certainly a good cross-section of these are. And so whatever process that individual has, they factor that in, they make their decision, and then that spits out the bottom as the final decision. So that's how this works. So I wanted to go through the results a little bit of this methods review. Yeah, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. And like I said, there's 6 key theme areas, so I just wanted to touch on those real quick. And we'll talk about it again at the end. So the fire environment. Fire environment is just the physical conditions that exist in the area. So think things like fire danger rating or the fire behavior, what the weather is, and and then what I have listed here underneath on the left is the fire danger rated, so U and B, so that'd be unaligned and barriers. And so if you look at this while I go through the presentation, those are just the ones that were sort of the most prevalent. So weather and climate were really the ones that were favorable. So if a decision maker was looking at the fire environment and they thought that the fire behavior or the weather or the fuel conditions were favorable, that was something that tended to facilitate that decision, versus if they thought there was going to be unfavorable fire conditions or just the fire danger rating was too high, that tended to push them away from the decision. Excuse me. The next one is actually fire outcomes, which is a little different than fire environment. The fire environment is just the way that they think the fire environment is, which is actually before the fire most of the time. And I think that's an important distinction, because the outcomes is actually what they think, if they allow the fire to burn, what it would be, or it could be something that they're looking to avoid as well too. And you can see that in this case, there's actually more facilitators just from a presence of factors standpoint. And this one is kind of like hopeful. I like this one, guy. I think it shows a lot of hope for people that if they decide to manage the fire, what they're expecting is a lot of good things like reduced fire behavior in the future, improved forest health, reduce exposure to fire staff, all kinds of different reasons. But if you see on the outcome standpoint, on the barrier side, actually air quality is the thing that they worried about the most. And again, this is pre-2009 all the way back to the 70s. The presence of air quality and degraded air quality and that impacting neighbors is, has been long present as a factor in the decision making. And I put a little asterisk next to that, because what that shows, if you look at the table, is that it's actually we're not doing a magnitude study per se, but it definitely was the one that was the most times mentioned across papers. And I think in this case, it actually was, under outcomes, So under unaligned, it was air quality concerns were the most mentioned. So, all right, so that's fire outcomes. The next key theme area was actually the socio-political context. And this is an important one. This is one where they're looking at the local politics, especially economics. Economics was a big factor in this. And you see this in fires. I mean, I deal with this all the time, where they're, worried about the local outfitter being impacted or the local lodge. There's been a lot of fires in the Sierras, the last 5-6 years, where, most people make their money during the summer going into Yosemite, outfitters, that sort of thing. And then just having relationships in place, especially with the elected leaders. Those are the kind of factors that are looked at in the socio-political context. And the socio-political context is really externally looking, it's looking outward. And then there's looking inward, which we would call institutional influences. And that's just how the culture of the agency itself, policies, that sort of thing, that's how that affects it. Something that showed up a lot in this, in both unaligned, especially unaligned, was actually funding. But we kind of think that's kind of remnant, because back in the old days when we had prescribed natural fire, which was the name of that, and actually even WFU, wildland fire use, which was the policy immediately before 2009, especially PNF, you actually had to fund that out of project funds. So you actually had to have funding available already on the unit. It wasn't the wildfire suppression funds that paid for that. So that could both be, a lot of times in the past, it was actually a barrier or something that they were concerned about if they didn't have it. And then in a wildland fire use, you couldn't pay for emergency stabilization after the fire. So there was risk associated with that as well too. But again, the institutional influence is one of the things that was a big thing that people looked at. A big factor was the culture of the agency. And so, and especially at the local unit. So if the local unit had a fire culture, they discussed, like say a place like the Gila National Forest or something that has a long history of fire, that was something that was a strong facilitator. But if someone was stepping in, even if they wanted to see wildland fire use occur or managed fire occur, but there just wasn't a culture, there was people that were defaulting to suppression a lot of times, that made it really hard to actually make that decision to manage the fire. And that came across pretty clear in this. The next one is operational considerations, and this one's interesting because by far the most prevalent factor was looking at resource availability, which is something that I found in the research that I'm doing now as well too. So quite simply, if there was a perception that there weren't enough operational resources to actually manage the fire, it was something that served as a strong barrier, because you're not going to go and do a managed fire or try to manage fire if you don't think anybody's going to come, if you don't think you're going to have the engines, the crews, the overhead resources to actually manage it, which is kind of interesting if you think about it, because that actually shows a pretty clear distinction in how people look at those fires. Because you wouldn't have a fire that you're going to suppress. Well, I guess maybe in these days you would, but most of the time you're not worried. You think that you're going to put in the resource orders and people are going to come help try to suppress that fire, and you're going to get a lot more sort of understanding and helping people that want to come help that, versus a managed fire, which there was a lot more question about people would come and actually help you, or be willing to allocate resources to that effort. So, yeah, I don't want to beat that one up too much. And then finally, the last one is perceived risk, and perceived risk was especially risk aversion. You can actually see one of the ways that we thought about displaying this was using some sort of like scaled bubble chart, where it'd be like a small bubble if there was just a couple, and a big bubble if there was a lot of factors. You can actually see there's 13 different factors under risk aversion on the barrier side. There was a lot of reasons from a risk standpoint to not manage a wildfire. Anywhere from just having a bias, a lot of career concern, and then just you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different things that start with threat to firefighters, private property, reputation, etc. And even risk on the underlying factors, where there was just generalized risk, concern for risk expressed. But what's probably the most interesting is that you see that I put an asterisk here under perceived risk. Despite all those factors not to manage a wildfire, from a present standpoint, just you wanting to do it as an agency administrator, fire manager, just that personal ethic to actually do it was the most prevalent facilitator. Even though there are only two, personal satisfaction, but just wanting to do it really served as a way to overcome that. And again, this is something that I've actually found in the research I'm doing now. So kind of interesting. Okay, so discussion. So just talk a little bit about the results and the discussion about this mixed methods review paper. As I mentioned, there were more barriers than facilitators just overall. I think it was something like 40. I should have written this down, but I think there was like 43 barriers and like 31 facilitators. So it is almost 25% more barriers than facilitators, just from a reason standpoint, just from a factor standpoint. And then very clearly from what you just saw on this last slide, managed fire is viewed by agency administrators, fire managers, the public as a riskier endeavor. It's just viewed that way. Whether it be sociopolitical pressure, or you're concerned about their career, or any of those factors. And then, from a risk versus reward, which really ties back to the risk in general, but there was a lot of interesting discussion about there's just no incentive to do it. There's all kinds of incentives to put the fire out. You get to put the white hat on. Everyone, most people expect it. Of course, there is some people that prefer fires to be managed and to have that benefit, but just in general, society as represented in these papers, and the culture of the agencies really moved, and the incentive was to put the fire out, and it just wasn't worth it, except for that personal ethic, which is just so interesting. And then culture. I think the culture, showing that places where there was a culture that actually existed, and that showed through very clearly in some of the papers. Some of the papers were folks from the Whitecap study in Montana. There was a lot from the Southwest, actually, that just had showed, for whatever reason, that there was a culture for managing fires, and that made it a lot easier. And I think that's not only internally, but that's externally. It's kind of what the relationships that have been built over time expected. And then finally, one of the things that we noticed is that, going back to the complexity of the decision to manage a fire or not, we didn't see clear, just sort of like obvious evidence for this in the paper, but after we coded it and saw 110 decision factors, just put yourself into the shoes of a decision maker trying to make the right decision, trying to make the best decision for the landscape, for the people that are working for them. So we sort of speculated that the complexity of the decision itself could actually be a barrier to managing fire, because there's clearly as we talk about this default, and this segues into the next part, but it's clearly easier to suppress that fire, even if there's negative ramifications to this. If there's negative ramifications for a managed fire, it's treated a lot like an escaped wildfire, or I'm sorry, an escaped prescribed fire, which is that you did this on purpose, it didn't happen the way you wanted it to, so there was an error, versus having an initial attack fire that escapes, becomes a million-acre fire, which I've had in my career. But no one ever came along and said you did something wrong. That really just doesn't exist, and I don't think it's ever really existed in the culture of the agency. So just the complexity of the decision itself, although we didn't find direct evidence for that, I think it showed through, and I think it exists. So, and I use this picture because this is a public meeting. It's really hard for an agency administrator to stand in front of that public meeting unless they have that personal ethic, and they have a lot of good reasons to tell these angry people that are breathing in smoke and are worried that they're doing something other than full suppression. All right, and then finally the framework. So the managed fire decision framework. It's a little obtuse, it's a little big and complicated, but I think that there's some real value to it. I think there's value to sort of understanding how these things all fit together as a decision maker, which is really what this was made for. As an incident commander, anybody that wants to try to work on a culture, you can start looking at these 6 key theme areas and start wondering, like, how are we set for fire outcomes? What's our socio-political context? What's the culture of the agency? Start looking at them individually, and I don't know, checking them off, or start to work on them, or whatever. And start tying into things like national cohesive strategy, and clearly it's moving us in a direction for resilient communities in the landscape. And the other thing that we noticed as well too is making a really good coding strategy, a qualitative coding strategy. It's actually what I started using for the research that I collected this spring. So that's the reason for the framework. So real quick, hopefully we're doing good on time. Looking for a timer. Liz, is there any way you could tell me how we doing on time? I know I was aiming for 35 minutes.
Yep, you've got a few minutes left. It's 12:28, so you've got time.
Okay. All right, cool. Well, I'll try to get through this. There's much less to this. So we published the review last September. It had been obviously written well before that. So one of the interesting things is last year I was able to go out on fires and just sort of work and watch to see. It was really pretty interesting for me just to see, in discussions with agency administrators, people on teams, cooperating agencies, just to see, okay, yeah, that's from the framework, that's an environmental concern, that's a socio-political concern, or whatever. That's why I said for my present research that I'm working on now, there was 3 things that we're trying to do. The first one is to validate the decision factors that we found in the MMR paper, the mixed methods review paper, and then also corroborate the framework. And I put 2 check marks next to that. We haven't written it up. The analysis is not done, but just anecdotally from the interviews that we did complete almost 50 interviews, and then also just anecdotal work out on fires. Really, it's really pretty cool. It actually worked out even better than I hoped it would in terms of, I didn't find something that I was like, oh, I really think that should be another key theme area or whatever. So just, I don't know, it just seems to be working pretty well. I was pretty pleased with that. And then the last thing that the research I'm trying to do is, and this is the first time I'm sort of mentioning this public, so I'm a little nervous about it, is testing this hypothesis that I've been working on the last few years, which is called the default suppression hypothesis. And talking to my committee members and Sarah, we're not sure whether this is going to be a hypothesis, which isn't always necessary, of course, in social science. So this could be just my predilection from coming from forestry background, the quantitative sciences. We could be testing a narrative. We're not quite sure yet. I'm hoping we can have some discussion with that later. But anyway, so the default suppression hypothesis is the way I've framed it the last few years, and of course this is subject to change, is actually pretty simple. And it really, just in simple terms, for what I've seen in my career and what, reading literature and other research, is that you really only need, what the hypothesis says is they only need one reason to suppress the fire. And really, the way I set up the hypothesis in the document so far is that the only reason is that it exists. So if the fire exists, there is going to be a response, and it's always okay to put it out. There's almost never a reason that it's not okay to put it out. And that's why if you look at this little diagram here, the 6 key theme areas in the middle, and each one of them, any of the factors that are under that could be a sufficient reason to move the fire to full suppression. Whereas if you're going to manage a fire for other than full suppression, you really, again, the hypothesis states that you need 1 plus X reason, or more than one reason, basically, is what I'm trying to say. Or you need some sort of tipping point of reasons. And that is what when I was doing interviews this summer, really trying to ascertain is, what is the tipping point? Is there one factor, one key theme area that's more important? Like, is it, if, the fire environment is just so great, is that one reason good enough to manage the fire? And what I've found in the preliminary analysis, very preliminary, is that it doesn't appear to be so simple. I really expected to hear basically one reason to put the fire out. So it's sort of half true that I'm seeing so far. Is I'm actually finding people are having more than one reason to put the fire out, or at least they're able to produce more than one reason to put the fire out. But in order to manage for other than full suppression, there's definitely that part does appear to be valid, where they have their own sort of internal tipping point, or their own sort of threshold that they have to meet in order to, for themselves, be satisfied that they can go in front of the public and those around them and manage it for such a thing. And as I said here, I'd love to discuss this later. I hope we have time to do that. So, and then just some other preliminary observations from this research. I'll go through these kind of quickly. First one is the decision factors and framework. I already talked about this. Again, I feel like they're going to be validated. I haven't written it up yet. Hasn't gone through peer review or anything like that. But I do actually feel pretty good about that. The other thing is the language we use, and this means a couple different things. We all know that managed fire is a term that some people love, some people hate. We don't know what to call this. Other than full suppression is a bit onerous, even though that's what the Nick uses in the IMRR report to describe these kind of fires. So we're still struggling as a culture, as a wildland fire culture, to figure out what we're calling these fires. And I think part of the problem is that because we don't have a name for it, we don't know what to call it. It's very difficult to communicate that. And there's been other papers that people have written and published that specifically address this. It's just that it really came clear in the research that we did this summer. And the other part is that, if you don't have a way to talk about it, it's really hard to be transparent about it as well, too. And I feel like what I'm seeing is that agency administrators are really struggling. So instead of just being completely transparent about, I'm not saying they were obfuscating at all, it's just they didn't really know how to communicate it. And so they were finding and casting about ways to try to discuss what they were doing on the landscape and struggling. Social acceptance or risk and pressures, there's a lot of that. A lot of times when I was talking to agency administrators this summer, not only did I not really know how to discuss what they were talking about, it was pretty clear for me as a fire manager that they were doing a confine contain strategy, or doing this strategy or that. Or sometimes I was seeing that they were doing a confine contain strategy or a managed fire strategy, but they were so new to the job, they didn't really know what the words were. And a lot of people were getting very pressured by cooperators and other folks who didn't have that in their policy. And then it seems like with the 2009 policy, I know it was intended to open up that decision space, but there's some theory associated with, you open up a decision space for decision makers, it's actually too much, and makes it harder to make the decision. I think it's called Liebig's law or something. Then grassroots effort. I put these pictures here because I don't know if you guys recognize what is in this picture, but there's my friend Sarah Billings, fuels people. You got Adam from the Arrowhead Hotshots. These are the people that are managing fires right now, and they're doing it on their own. They're doing it despite what research says, despite what the agency administrators say, despite what CAL FIRE says. So what you're looking at there on this picture is, that's actually a PSD, a drone delivered PSD burn operation that we were doing on the river complex. And so, a lot of the future of firefighting is this looking at the screen, trying to set your firing operation. And there's no input from almost anybody on this. But I have to say, this is a huge change from when I started about 20 years ago, where, just lighting the fire from the bottom of the hill and just trying to get it black. I am just amazed at how nuanced the fire crews out there are in their approach. They know to burn things underneath an inversion at night, backfire down the hill, and it's just really cool to see. So despite everything, it's happening. Managed fire is happening no matter what. And it's in the hand of the practitioners right now. So I almost feel like we need to catch up to it in a way. Just anecdotally, last year was kind of a droughty year, a bad year, especially in the Southwest, but we were still seeing good fire effects, and people were sort of being like, oh, wow, that's weird. That doesn't fit the narrative that we only have to manage fires during wet years and, in October when the snow's flying, then it's okay to manage a fire. Beware of safety. I just mean that safety, I really noticed in my discussions and interviews that safety is being used as a surrogate in a lot of ways for managing fires. So if an agency administrator knows they want to have an indirect strategy on a fire, a lot of times safety is being used to justify that, which I'm not here to adjudicate whether that's true or not, but it seems like it's becoming the main mechanism for not just going doing direct and silly, crazy, risky things. And then finally, default suppression, which obviously I'm interested in, the illusion of control. There's a lot of push from socio-political standpoint right now. Cooperators, Cal Fire, the Tamarack Fire on the HT didn't really do a lot of favors for that. And there was recent legislation trying to get us back to a 10 a.m. suppress everything, which we just kind of everyone in my peer group just kind of laughs because it's like we're not able to do that now. Why would a new policy that says that we have to go put everything out, change anything when really most folks feel like we just need to accept the realities of the situation on the ground. So, and that is the end of the presentation. This is a photograph I took. I don't know. I thought it was funny. It just, despite all our firefighting efforts, nature always does what it wants in the end. So you can put out a 5,000-gallon water pumpkin, but a horse is still going to go take a drink from it. So that's the end of my presentation. Hopefully Sarah's here and questions. Anything?
All right, thanks, Stephen. Yeah, as Stephen said, both he and Sarah are available for questions. So if there's something that you'd like to ask, you can either raise your hand on Zoom and ask it out loud, or you can just type it into the chat box. So we'll give everyone a couple moments to mull everything over. You've given us a lot to think about, Stephen, so.
Okay, cool.
I will throw something in there for you to think. I was intrigued looking at, I hadn't noticed it before, in the decision framework, in the facilitator list, in the facilitators of outcomes. It was kind of interesting that reduced future fire risk was not in there, because that seems to be a dominant argument nowadays for fire. So I thought, I was intrigued. And do you think that's a byproduct of the fact that everything's before, what that's based on is pre-2009 mostly?
You're asking me, Sarah, if I had to say, that's an interesting, because it doesn't show up in the perceived risk one either. I think it's actually embedded in a bunch of the other facilitators and some of the other key theme areas, actually, like smoking, like in operational, better access, reduced resource needs. Those are all, this is the thing too, this is all so complex. Like you might push on one and then you're going to move another factor and they all interweave. Really hard to parse all that out. So, really you're looking at one thing, you're always looking at two or three other things. So yeah, that's about the best answer I can get for that one, I think. That's thanks. Yeah, that's a good insight.
We've got a question in the chat from Andy. She says, the personal drive part to overcoming barriers seems so true. So is the cultural message. How do you think we can help foster those things?
You want to take that, Sarah, or you want me to?
Go for it.
Okay. How do you, well, okay, the easy answer for overcoming barriers, any barrier, I personally think is in, incentives. There's basically no incentive structure at all for anybody to manage a fire, for resource benefit, except for if you're able to, claim the target if you happen to have NEPA under it, which is, a very wonky agency thing, but people do look at that. I don't actually know. I think the answer I would say is I'm hoping to explore that with time, is how we can build that culture. Because, in talking to people, I did do a couple site visits, and where there is a culture of managing fire, it's very holistic. It's the cooperators are on board. The local grocery store is okay selling the message. I really think agency administrators need to spend more than 5 minutes in their job and to build those relationships. build that mutual understanding. And the only way you do that is through, iterative fires, multiple fires, share the successes, share the failures. And I will say one thing that I discovered Region 3 is doing, I actually found this in another paper that I'm working on about WFDIS, is that they have the shared risk dialogue. So if a local unit wants to manage a fire, they actually bring the regional office in and they have a dialogue about that. So you have multiple levels of risk sharing there. That's something I'm hoping to do in my current job here in Region 5 in California, just to kind of share that risk around. I think those are the kind of things that allow you to build a culture.
Great, thanks. Scott asked, oh, sorry, Sarah, did you have something you wanted?
Can I just follow up a question on that real quick, just since it was my question? Is that okay?
Oh yeah, of course.
I was just thinking of that from the perspective of the exchange networks and the kind of work we do, whether field trips from one area of administrators from one area to another, if we can manage that, or other things like, what could we do on that kind of side to kind of make these connections and help people see the value and get them past some of those tipping points.
Yes, yeah, I would agree with that. There's so many different avenues at it, and this is a cool time where there are those learning exchanges, and there's a lot of people that are coming into it. And, I mean, like this consortium all across. I mean, there's just so many, just so much good outlets for this information. So I don't know.
I think one of the challenges, Andy, is that in the end, and I'd be interested in Stephen's thoughts on this, is so much is dependent about the internal incentives and rewards they get, that unless there's sort of better incentives. I had a brief moment during Stephen's talk of thinking, can we award like the best managed fire manager every year, or just something that recognizes people who are successfully getting stuff done on the ground, that would start to provide more value internally towards non-suppression. So I think, Andy, it's a really good idea. And I think it can go at the margins, but in the end, it's that internal incentives part that I suspect is critical.
Yeah.
Would you agree, Stephen?
Yeah, I almost feel like that would need to come from outside the agency, like some of the professional organizations recognizing that, perhaps, AFE or IAWF or something like that. Things like that work. I mean, they really do. People like trophies, right? So, there's always there's always reviews. We always focus on the negative. That's part of the problem with federal agencies anyway, is this what do they call it? The learning organization, where you're always focused on what's going wrong to fix it, but there's hardly ever any discussion of when things go right, especially with managed fire. So, I mean, I think advertising those sort of things, case studies, whatever the venue might be, I mean, that's an opportunity.
So you see internal changes based on external pressures. Is that kind of what you're saying?
From a Forest Service standpoint, almost entirely, if I can go out on a limb.
There you go, Andy.
Okay, are we ready for another question, or is any more follow-ups on that? Okay. So Scott asked, the Clean Air Act creates a distinction between prescribed fire and wildfire, that the former is man-made and subject to regulation regarding smoke, but the latter is natural and does not. Was there any mention of managed wildfire as a gray area when considering barriers in the interviews and research you've done?
Yeah, it was definitely discussed. This particular gray area that that the question regards that Scott asked is, I didn't see as much in this literature, and I think part of it is just because, again, it was all pretty much 2009, and I know the Clean Air Act has been around a lot longer than that, but it wasn't specifically mentioned. But I will just say, I know it's different in different parts of the country. I do know here in California, we've had a lot of discussions with the California Air Resource Board, and especially the local air districts, where they are actually trying to manage, or well, they're approaching managed wildfire other than full suppression fires as a prescribed fire, basically, where they're actually trying to do the same thing, where they and I'm not an air quality specialist, and I don't want to pretend I am. I just work with them enough to be dangerous. But I know that they want to charge like per acres, and there's been a lot of discussion where we're trying to educate them. And I will say, though, now there's a lot less tension with that. because they are understanding that via our policy, every unintentional fire is a wildfire, whether we manage it for whatever objective. But I think I think in most places we've gotten past that gray area, but it's a pretty important one because they hold the trump card. The Clean Air Act is outside of the agency's ability to change or modify or whatever. So it's kind of interesting working with the air resource boards. And then just anecdotally, air quality, I think, is the single most, I don't know, not limiting or most important factor to get through. And I think in the end, what I'm seeing in a lot of the research is people really looked at air quality as a decision factor. It's almost like the least common denominator, I guess. Hopefully that answers your question. It's a real good question, an important one.
Sarah, did you want to add anything? Okay.
Next couple questions are good ones, so we've got to get to them.
Okay. All right. So Jonathan asks, of the factors that lead to the decision to suppress, do you think that there is a hierarchy or ranking of importance? For example, last year resource availability or political decisions seem to override everything else.
That is a tough one. I'd be interested in what Sarah thinks too. My gut reaction is, like, of the 110, there's very clearly more that matter. I think air quality is a huge barrier, as I just mentioned. Certainly resource availability, I think, is a huge one. And I'm doing actually some different research right now looking at the fuels organization for the build up for the infrastructure, and actually resource availability is even showing that is like 5 times more than any other factor. So, I mean, if you want to look at resource availability, it's like, you're never gonna be able to do anything. It's like having a party and nobody shows up. You know, it's not gonna be a party. You can't have a managed fire if you're not gonna have any crews or engines or anything like that. So that's definitely a filter. But there's almost like 3 or 4 or 5 that are probably all pretty same in terms of a hierarchy standpoint. So that might sound like a cop out of an answer, but I think it's also very conditional to the area, because again, some areas you might have huge political support. You might have some ranchers that want to see you burn, so the socio-political stuff is good to go. But you might not have the people, or the environmental conditions might not be adequate, or whatever. Or it's late in the season and people are tired. So many different things.
And I think there's a hope that as we dig into the transcripts, we'll be able to like look at how people describe their decision process and begin to maybe, it's not clear yet, but maybe get a sense for what if there is a hierarchy, or at least a tiers of the factors that outweigh other factors. And it'll be interesting on the air quality, because a project I was involved in with Courtney Schultz at CSU was looking at prescribed fire, and the sort of clear answer there was that air quality isn't as big an issue as people say, that it's often used as a convenient reason not to do more prescribed burning. But if you, as Stephen said, have built up all the relationships you need, then it's really not a major barrier, and the resource issues are the really critical one. And so some of it might simply be that we're early enough on in sort of trying to have more managed fire, that some of that part that has been being built for 20 years with prescribed fire needs to be built for managed fire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you kind of touched on this, but Matthew asked a follow-up question. Do you think growing workforce capacity gaps will further restrict opportunities for managed fire?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think it could go a couple different ways. So I'm going to put my optimistic hat on. I actually think it could increase the opportunities for managed fires, because I think one of the things that we need to do with our workforce is work smarter, not harder. So I think I honestly think the answer would be, the fewer people we have, if we had them better trained, better understanding, we could actually manage fires more and to a greater extent, because it's almost like forcing this. I mean, actually, this is what's happening right now. This is why we're actually seeing so many fires where we're doing large scale firing operations, is because we don't have the people, like literally don't have the people to assign to it, to even try to do a direct strategy. So, I mean, just the last 2-3 years, in my experience in California here, we're sort of forced into that point, but nobody wants to call it a managed fire. They're just saying, we're doing an indirect strategy due to resource availability, which I'm like, yeah, I guess that's true. But at the same time, like, look at it. We're putting really good fire on the ground, like that picture I talked about, using the drones and this and that. That being said, I'm pretty sure that what the response will be from the agency is that we need to double down and put all the fires out early and, you know, keep them small and hit them hard and all that sort of thing. So that's my pessimistic, optimistic hat. I'm working to do the optimistic side.
I think the middle is sort of a maybe potential middle ground on that is that resource constraints can be a problem or can be a major issue, but they also tend to be a major source of creativity. So it just depends on whether or not we want to leverage them to be creative and come up with ways of doing things differently with more limited resources. And that's a challenge and not straightforward, but most places when you have resource limitations and businesses and stuff, that's when they're creative. When you have tons of money, you have no incentive to be creative. So
yeah.
So Kate put into the chat, maybe someone in this meeting recalls why the agencies abandoned appropriate management response, plain language that anyone can understand and doesn't obfuscate that there may be multiple strategies according to wide-ranging factors. Stephen, did you get any feedback about the best language to describe this complexity in terms that the public can understand? Or maybe the policy language isn't that important?
Yeah. So I believe kind of feel like I like policy. My understanding is I think the AMR policy was an interim policy in 2008.
yeah, it was like 1 year.
Yeah, it was 1 year, and I actually think the I actually like the AMR policy, and actually it's funny because AMR existed as a policy. I can't remember, but it existed earlier, like maybe in the 80s or maybe the 70s. I can't. Somebody else correct me on that one. But AMR actually existed previously. So they resurrected it in 2008. It was for like 3 or 4 forests. Actually, Sarah did a paper where one of the forests was looking at it. I think it was like gun barrel fire paper, where they were taking an AMR approach. And I honestly think that it was just a stepping stone to what we have now, which is actually, if you look at it, more open in terms of an option standpoint. So I liked AMR because you're right, appropriate managed response. It's in a nutshell. It's a nice 3-letter acronym that people can understand. The question here, I actually do think policy language is important, and I think part of our problem is that people don't really understand what a planned or unplanned fire is. And it's amazing to me how many people don't even really understand that even within that, there's sub-nested policy pathways that you can do and stuff. So yeah, I don't know. I don't want to just cast a bunch of shade on the policy because I like it on the one hand, but it definitely makes it harder to communicate. And that's, I've experienced that firsthand. Go ahead, Sarah.
I think there's a distinction that is important to make between language that is appropriate for a policy versus the language that we use with the public. So oftentimes we sort of feel like we have to use the policy language to talk to the public. And like the planned versus unplanned is extremely problematic for talking to the public. But there are, because the one thing that will make them like the management better is knowing the amount of planning that went into it. So describing a managed fire as unplanned is not a good way to start explaining the amount of planning that went into that, the decision to manage it, right? But yeah, there are very good policy reasons for why, and legal reasons for why they have the planned versus unplanned language. My memory of the appropriate management response is it ran into a very similar issue with the managed fire term, which is people would say, well, what do you mean? Every fire we manage appropriately. You know, like our decision to suppress is an appropriate response for that fire. So they ran into sort of that similar pushback on lack of clarity of meaning. And I think in that sense, talking to the public, we are better off sort of just stepping away from the internal policy language and just be straight. So, you know, social license is a term that's come up that seems to be really popular and is very problematic for different reasons I won't go into. But, you know, the people said, okay, what do we use instead? I said, how about we're working to build support and understanding amongst the public of what we're doing, right? That's pretty clear. There's nothing to mislead. And it explains really what you're trying to do. So I think rather than getting focused on the right language or the right phrases or the right terms, we're better off focusing on just being clear and then use the language that makes sense for that audience.
We've got we've got a lot of great comments in the chat, but the next question that we have, and perhaps the last question that we have time for, is the fire use modules used to be reserved for this work. I'm not clear on if those are gone or how they are being incorporated. Would this be helpful still? And that's from Andy.
But
Okay.
you should also read Madeline's comment after that. That while then fire modules still exist, they are still focused on managed fire, but do suppression too.
Yeah, that is true. That's what they, yeah, when the policy changed. And I like Dana's comment actually early too, and I don't want to skip that because it's a really important one. We can come back to that. Yeah, the WFU crews, they switched to the WFM crews. They are primarily, and you talk to those folks, they're pretty frustrated actually that they end up getting sucked into suppression as much as they do. And one of the things that we're looking at doing is if we do build out fuels crews in the region, I'm hoping to try to retain them to be first in resources for managing fires for electrical suppression here in California. So that's a whole other discussion. If you don't mind me lingering on Dana, she talked about Cal Joyner. First of all, Dana, thanks for joining. I really appreciate that. And what she brings up is the importance of leadership. When I did my interviews, I did a whole bunch of them in Region 3, and I still hear people talk about Cal Joyner and his leadership and his vision and that sort of thing. And I don't know who's all on the call right now, but I would sure love to see that sort of leadership at the highest levels in my agency and elsewhere, because it's unbelievably important. For instance, in the Forest Service, the chief of the Forest Service puts out a letter every year. And one of the things that struck me was how much agency administrators actually pay attention to that. And they really do take their marching orders from it. So it's really important. I don't even know if the chief knows how much people actually pay attention to that. So, if the letter comes out this year, and it should be coming out soon, and it says, we're going to be suppressing all the fires because of the Tamarack fire, then that's the way it's going to be. And there's been letters like that have come out frequently, and people do modify their behaviors. So anyway, Dana just brings up a really good point there, and I just wanted to make sure we address that. Thanks, Liz.
Sure, and there's a few other good comments in the chat. Travis says it has to be a career advancement incentive where there is accountability for doing less suppression and more management of fire. Neil said resource availability during PL 4 and 5 is a problem, but we can overcome if we better prioritize and support non-fed resources. Barb mentioned a success story of a community that had an opportunity to manage a fire but didn't feel like they had support, so they suppressed it. They worked hard to develop relationships with the community, and then when they had another lightning ignition, they went for it.
Yeah, that's huge. That came across in the places where forests and units were managing fires. All of them said that they had community support. I honestly don't think you can do it without it. So if you're going to invest your time as an agency administrator, spend time with those folks. Sorry.
Yeah, and if you're up for one last question, Michelle says, do you have thoughts on how we message or explain percent completion, measure success when a fire is managed other than full suppression?
Well, there's two different questions maybe, but I mean, I hate to lift the veil here, but we don't know. I mean, on the teams, I work on incident management teams, like it's a wag really. I mean, this is a whole other process I'm working on, which is actually describing our objectives during fires a lot more concretely, and a lot more from a more granular level, because I think we really need to start breaking down our objectives, what we're trying to do out there from a communication standpoint and from a messaging standpoint. I don't want to speak for how other teams work because that would be inappropriate, incident management teams, but I think people struggle with, are we 60% of the way or 75% of the way there? And I think this is an opportunity for research to help us with that. It's an opportunity for our risk folks, people that look at objectives and that sort of thing. And yeah, I think that needs a lot of work. And then messaging it, I mean, it's a struggle. It's one of those things, like if you don't understand it yourself, how are you going to explain it to other people? I think a lot of people suffer from that. I'd be interested in other people's comments.
Sarah, did you want to add to that?
I think that's an excellent point that, if you can't explain it to yourself, how do you explain it to others? I would just say that I go back to my just don't get caught into language. And like what I see that makes me worried is we're sort of defaulting to call it's a full suppression fire, but we're doing monitoring it. And I'm like, but that does not sound like full suppression. You know, historically suppression equals we're putting the fire out. So full suppression sounds like we're really putting the fire out. And so I think it's, again, it's like, don't get bogged down in here's the right language, say simply what you're doing. You know, we are working to contain the fire. We have line that should hopefully keep it from traveling any further, barring terrible wind conditions, having been on the Camera Peak fire. You know, and but on these angles, we're just monitoring it because it's going into the backcountry. There's not any values at risk, and it has ecological values. Again, that's pretty straightforward. It is more than 2 words, but it is a lot more clear and not misleading.
Great. Well, thank you both, Stephen and Sarah. We're just past 1 o'clock, so we're going to let everyone go, but this was a great presentation and a really lively discussion. So thank you both very much. And thank you all for attending today. This presentation will be available on the Frames platform in about a week, and you can find a link to that on the Southwest Fire Science Consortium website. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out.
Yeah, I'd just like to say if anybody has any input at all to the hypothesis or anything, and just thanks so much for coming. I'd really love to hear it. We're kind of trying to, you know, see what people think about that. Sorry, Liz.
Great, thank you.